The moment Evelyn saw Marcus in the studio, she knew he was different. There was something magnetic about him, an intensity in the way he carried himself. As he stepped into the room, she couldn't help but notice how the soft morning sunlight bathed his face, giving him an almost ethereal quality, as though he had just stepped out of one of her paintings. She had worked with many models over the years, but Marcus was unlike anyone she had ever met. His presence seemed to fill the space, drawing her focus in ways that made her feel both inspired and vulnerable. As she started sketching his face, she noticed how each line she drew seemed to come alive, almost as though the portrait was speaking back to her. It was the perfect blend of connection and distance, a dynamic she had never experienced before. There was a rawness to him, an unspoken depth that made her wonder if he, too, felt something in the space between them. With every glance they exchanged, Evelyn began to sense something shifting, something powerful growing within her that went beyond the artist-model relationship. Their time together in the studio was charged with an energy that was hard to define. For the first time, she began to wonder if this man, this subject, had the ability to awaken something in her heart she had long buried. Their sessions together quickly turned from professional to personal. It wasn't intentional, not at first. What started as a simple arrangement of artist and model, with him posing for her while she painted or sketched, slowly evolved into something far more intimate. Over the course of their sessions, the conversations between them became less about the technical aspects of the work and more about their lives. Evelyn learned that Marcus had grown up in a rough neighborhood, struggling to make ends meet. He had always dreamed of being an artist, but life had kept him from pursuing that passion. His story resonated with her, and as they talked, she began to see him not just as a model, but as a person, a complex, layered individual with dreams and fears of his own. There was something deeply human about his vulnerability, and it made her want to protect him, to help him succeed in ways that went beyond her art. In turn, Marcus began to open up to Evelyn in ways he hadn't with anyone before. He trusted her in a way that was rare for him. Their quiet moments in the studio, when words weren't necessary and the only sound was the soft scratch of her pencil or brush, were filled with a delicate understanding. Slowly, those moments began to turn into dinners, walks in the park, and long talks about their hopes and regrets. It was as if the space between them, once filled only with art, had been replaced by something much more profound. They weren't just sharing their creative worlds, they were sharing their hearts. As the days passed, Evelyn found herself falling deeper into the bond they shared. It wasn't just about the art anymore. It was about Marcus, about his presence in her life and the way he made her feel. She started noticing things she hadn't before, the way his laugh echoed through the room, how his hands moved when he spoke, the way he looked at her as though he saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. She had always been independent, focused on her art, but something about Marcus made her want to be seen, too, not just as an artist, but as a woman. She had been so wrapped up in her work for so long, her identity tied so tightly to the brush strokes on her canvases, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be desired for who she was, not just what she created. Marcus was different. He appreciated her art, but he also appreciated her. And it was this subtle shift in their dynamic that made her realize, with a shock of awareness, that her feelings for him had deepened into something she wasn't prepared for. It was confusing, this mix of admiration and longing, but also terrifying. She had spent years building walls around her heart, convinced that love was a distraction. But now, she couldn't ignore what was happening. She was falling in love with him, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. One night, As they sat across from each other in a small cafe after a painting session, Evelyn found herself asking him a question she hadn't even realized she was harboring. Do you ever wonder what it feels like to be the subject of someone's deepest affection? Her voice was quieter than usual, filled with a vulnerability she hadn't intended to reveal. She didn't know why she had asked him that, or what answer she expected, but the words had slipped out before she could stop them. For a moment, Marcus didn't respond, his gaze dropping to his hands as if considering the question. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he looked up at her, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his lips. I think I'm starting to understand, he said, his voice gentle. It wasn't a confession of love, but there was something in the way he said it that made her heart race. It was the acknowledgement of the bond they had formed, the silent agreement between them that what they shared was more than just an artistic collaboration. The air between them shifted, and Evelyn felt a strange flutter in her chest, a mix of hope and uncertainty. This moment, brief as it was, marked a turning point in their relationship. It was no longer just about the paintings, the sessions, or the art. It was about the space they had created between them, a space where feelings were no longer hidden or ignored. Everything changed when Evelyn received the email about the upcoming auction. She had known her paintings had garnered attention in the art world, but this was different. This was an invitation to be part of an exclusive event in New York, a chance to have her work shown alongside some of the biggest names in the industry. She had poured so much of herself into these new pieces, and the thought of seeing them displayed in such a prestigious setting filled her with excitement. But when she arrived at the gallery, something caught her off guard. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw a familiar piece on the wall, but it wasn't one of her own. At first, she thought she had made a mistake. But as she looked closer, the brush strokes felt all wrong. The colors were off, the details weren't quite right. It was a version of her work, a twisted version of the painting she had created of Marcus, but it wasn't hers. It was fake. And the worst part was that it had been signed by Marcus Delacroix, a name she didn't recognize. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. Marcus hadn't just been posing for her, he had been using her work to create replicas and sell them under his own name. The horror of it made her stomach churn. This man, whom she had trusted, had been selling copies of her paintings without her knowledge, profiting off her talent while she remained in the dark. She walked through the gallery in a daze, her mind racing with questions she couldn't yet answer. How had this happened? Why hadn't Marcus told her? Had their relationship been nothing more than a means to an end for him? The excitement she had felt upon receiving the invitation evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp sense of betrayal. The confrontation that followed was nothing like Evelyn had imagined. When Marcus arrived at her studio that evening, she didn't wait for him to speak. She had already seen enough, understood enough, to know that there was nothing he could say that would make this right. Her heart, once open to him, was now closed tight, locked away behind a wall of anger and hurt. "You sold my paintings," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You used me. All this time, you've been selling my work, pretending it was yours. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" The words were out before she could stop them, and the pain in her chest only deepened as she watched his face fall. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen, as though he hadn't expected the confrontation to be so direct. "Evelyn, he began, but she cut him off. I don't want to hear it," she snapped, her voice thick with emotion. She paced in front of him, her hands trembling as she tried to process the shock. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me enough to tell me the truth?" The question lingered in the air, but he didn't have an answer. She had trusted him with everything: her heart, her art, her most vulnerable self. And he had lied to her. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper as he explained how it all began, how it started out small, with just a few paintings sold under his name to make ends meet. But as the money came in, he found it harder and harder to stop. "I didn't think it would be like this," he said quietly, his eyes filled with regret. "At first, I only sold a few, just to make ends meet. But the money was good, and then I got greedy. I couldn't stop." His words hung in the air, but they did nothing to ease the sting of betrayal. Evelyn felt the weight of his confession, but it did nothing to lessen her anger. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. He hadn't just used her art, he had used her heart.